Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute. We are continuing our study of the Olivet Discourse, and the question is: the Olivet Discourse a discussion of two subjects, the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 and the end of time, Christ coming out of heaven in a 5'5" Jewish man's body? Now, I'm just thrilled, to take note of the fact that there's a growing number of world-class scholars who recognize that the Olivet Discourse is not divided. It's all about AD 70. All right? And so, just for your information's sake, that is an undeniable reality. Now then, over the last three videos, I've been sharing with you, okay, we have Matthew 25, the time of the coming of the bridegroom for the wedding. Well, Isaiah 65, and I understand I haven't referred to the wedding specifically, all right, up to this point in our beginning investigation of Isaiah chapter 65. We're getting to the wedding, okay? We're getting to the wedding. But let me say this. Matthew chapter 25 talks about 5 foolish virgins who were not ready. They were unprepared. I wonder if those 5 foolish virgins might possibly represent those that Isaiah talks about when he says, I have stretched out my hands all the day long to a disobedient and a gainsaying people, saying, here am I, but they would not listen. You reckon there's a correlation there? Of Israel that was unprepared to recognize, to understand that the time of her salvation had come, just like Jesus castigated the Jews in Matthew 12 and Matthew chapter 16, when he said, you are able to discern the weather, and yet you do not know what time it is. In Luke chapter 19, in which he castigated them again, when he told them, you do not realize the time of your visitation. You see, Jesus was telling the Jews, you need to understand what time it is. And they refused. They're 5 foolish virgins. Nonetheless, yesterday we began our walk through Romans chapter 10, 14 and following, and showing its correlation with Isaiah 65. Why Isaiah 65? Well, because Isaiah 65 will take us to a discussion of the wedding banquet. Those who would enjoy it, those who would not. Pardon me. I wonder if that's 5 wise, 5 foolish. Of course it is. So, we examine the fact that Paul, in Romans chapter 10, is talking about how the gospel had been preached into all the world, and it had gone to Israel first, and Israel had rejected the offer of the kingdom, of the wedding. So Paul calls forth witnesses. Here in Romans chapter 10, verse 18, Paul is quoting from Psalms 19, their sound has gone out into all the world. To draw an analogy, just like nature bears witness to the glory and the existence of God, the gospel has been proclaimed to bear witness to the kingdom. Did Israel not know? Now remember, Paul has just said, Lord, have they all believed? No. Have they all accepted? No. Well, is it because they did not know? No. No pun intended. Because Moses says, I will provoke you to jealousy by those who are not a nation. I will move you to anger by a foolish nation. Okay, here we are. Here is Paul. He has quoted from the Psalm. Psalm 19, to declare that the gospel had been preached into all the world. He calls forth Moses. Now, he's already called forth Isaiah and the preaching of the gospel, preaching the good news from Isaiah 52. And now he's going to call forth Moses. So he has called forth the great messianic prophet of Isaiah. He has called forth the great king of Israel, David, in the psalm. And now he's calling forth Moses, the great lawgiver, all three of those witnesses bearing testimony to the fact that the gospel, the good news, being preached upon the mountains, so to speak, was declaring that the time of Israel's salvation, the time of Israel's wedding, Isaiah 52, 1 and 2, had come. That's how Paul could say, Paul wasn't saying, Isaiah foretold that sometime, eventually, the gospel of Israel's salvation would be preached. No. He is talking about the state of Israel and Israel's unbelief in the first century. The Israel that was rejecting the gospel as it was preached into all of the world. Paul is discussing the very real contemporary situation of the preaching of the gospel and Israel's rejection. And so he even segues into verses 20 and 21, which is, where I told you we were headed. And he says, Moses foretold Israel's rebellion. Moses foretold what I'm about to share with you, Paul said. Now, here's what you need to know about this citation. Here in Romans 10:19. This is directly from Deuteronomy 32, 19 to 21. A prophecy about Israel's last days. It's absolutely astounding to me. I have a massive volume laying on my desk right here, Commentary on the New Testament Use of the Old Testament by Greg Beale. Extremely helpful book in many, many ways. He denies that Deuteronomy 32 was a prophecy of Israel's last days. And yet twice in the chapter, it says it's talking about Israel's last days. Here's a world-class scholar denying what Deuteronomy says twice. There's something wrong here, folks. So, in Israel's last days, God said, I will provoke you, that's Israel, to jealousy by those who are not a nation. Now, who's he talking? He's talking about all 12 tribes in Deuteronomy 32. He's not talking about just the 10 northern tribes, and he's not talking about just the 2 tribes. He is talking about Israel, all 12 tribes. And in Israel's last days, I will provoke you to jealousy by those who are not a nation. When Paul quotes Deuteronomy, and by the way, you've got to really catch the power of this. Here, Paul introduces Deuteronomy 32, in verse 19, to bring Moses up as a witness against Israel of his generation, meaning that his generation is the last days of Israel. But he doesn't just do it once. In Romans 11, verse 11 and following, he quotes Deuteronomy 32 again about provoking Israel to jealousy, only this time he goes ahead and explains it just a little bit more. He would provoke Israel to jealousy. Well, Lord, how are you going to provoke Israel to jealousy? By calling the Gentiles, by calling the nations. Listen, it would not provoke Israel to jealousy by converting Israel. That's a tautology, and it's a redundancy, and it really doesn't make very good nonsense. You don't provoke Israel to jealousy by converting Israel. No, you provoke Israel to jealousy by converting someone that is not Israel, that Israel would look on their conversion and be jealous. And as a result of that jealousy, obey the gospel. So, the nation who is not a nation would be converted, provoking Israel to jealousy, and Israel would be converted. That's two conversions. It's not one, it's two conversions. And so, Paul says, but Isaiah is very bold and says, I was found by those who did not seek me. I was made manifest to those who did not ask for me. Oh, where did that come from? You know where it came from, Isaiah 65. But to Israel he says, all day long I have attached or stretched out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. You see, Paul is quoting verbatim from Isaiah 65, 1 and 2. That means he is quoting Isaiah 65 and bringing the entire prophetic context to the mind of his readers and applying that entire original context to his day, to his time. So what's happening in Paul's day? Israel was rejecting the gospel, as not only Paul, but other Christians went into the diaspora region and there reached out to the diaspora. And there was a righteous remnant that obeyed, but the majority did not. And when only a righteous remnant obeyed, and when the body of Israel refused, Paul says to that disobedient, gainsaying, rebellious corporate body majority, Paul says, seeing then that you count yourselves unworthy of eternal life from henceforth. Who's he talking to? Diaspora, Israel, rejecting the gospel. He's in Antioch of Pisidia, a region of the diaspora. Seeing then that you count yourselves unworthy of eternal life, henceforth we turn to the Gentiles. Folks, the Gentiles are not Israel. Certainly not in this text. So once again, Paul is applying Isaiah 65 to his generation. What does that mean? It means that as we will see, the great messianic wedding banquet was to be in the first century. And if the great messianic wedding banquet was to be in the first century, that means the coming of the Lord for the wedding and the banquet was to be in the first century. That means Matthew 25, 1 to 13, was fulfilled in the first century, not at some proposed end of the Christian age. And thus, futurism falls to the ground. Listen, folks, don't forget my January 2021 3-book special, U.S. orders only. Save yourself almost $20 by going to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Beautiful banner right up at the top. Just click on it and order it. You'll be glad you did. And by the way, thank you so much to all of you who have taken advantage of this special offer. Okay, don't forget, tomorrow we will continue video number 6 in our response and refutation of Kenneth Gentry's 4 articles which he wrote, attacking my brand new book, Watching for the Parousia, Were Jesus' Apostles Confused? Do you think that Paul was confused maybe about applying Isaiah to his generation? Well, you know he wasn't. Well, guess what? If Paul wasn't confused, neither were Jesus' apostles. Go to my website, order this book. As long as I'm making my videos in response to Kenneth Gentry, it will be at a reduced price of $15.95 plus shipping. Save yourself $2 on that. All right. Hey, I'm out of time. Thank you so much for joining me. Be sure to join me tomorrow, and I'll see you on the flip side.